myself. And if you let me start, today it has been my great pleasure to welcome my fellow justice ministers to Sweden to discuss some of the pressing issues currently on the EU's justice agenda. We are grateful that so many EU member states, institutions and agencies have chosen to be here with us during this dark and cold season of Sweden. One of the main priorities of the Swedish presidency is security. I stated that already yesterday on the press brief then. And the EU's most acute security challenge is, of course, the situation in Ukraine. The swift and decisive EU response to the invasion of Ukraine is a manifestation of our strength when we act together. The EU's continued support for Ukraine will require further efforts at both national and EU level. There is a lot that we, as justice ministers, can do to support Ukraine. For almost a year now, we have gotten reports of terrible acts being committed in Ukraine. Ensuring accountability for grave crimes is a top priority for our presidency, and all possible avenues to achieve this need to be explored. And I will get back to this in just a minute. Now, the citizens of the European Union have a right to be safe and secure. This is why we have put the fight against organized crime on the agenda for both the Interior and the Justice Ministers' meetings. There has long been a consensus among the member states that effective judicial cooperation is necessary in the fight against cross-border organized crime. Current cooperation provides us with several instruments. However, we must continuously work to develop and expand law enforcement authorities' toolkits. And to ensure effective judicial cooperation in the future, it's also important to consider possible next steps regarding legislation and practical cooperation. So in light of this, the ministers today received a presentation by Eurojust on its important work supporting national authorities to coordinate investigations and prosecutions of serious cross-border crime. We were given the opportunity to follow a fictional case and a case study so we could gain insights into some of the current challenges facing judicial cooperation in the EU. And in the subsequent discussions, I was happy to see that ministers highlighted the important role of Eurojust in the practical implementation of judicial cooperation. Ministers also exchanged views on the upcoming proposal on a new instrument for transfer of criminal proceedings. I welcome that ministers had a positive and constructive approach to this new instrument. The ministers' input today will contribute to our upcoming negotiations, and I trust that we soon will be able to add another effective tool to our judicial toolbox. Now, as I just mentioned, ensuring accountability for war crimes committed in Ukraine is a top priority for our presidency. It's most certainly a complex issue, but in order to accomplish this, judicial cooperation is crucial. Several member states have started national investigations into core international crimes committed in Ukraine. Ukraine and several EU member states have also, with support from Eurojust, established a joint investigation team. Furthermore, Eurojust has been given a new mandate to preserve, analyze and store evidence of core international crimes. The EU has acted with determination to ensure accountability. During our working lunch today, I was delighted and honored to virtually welcome our Ukrainian colleague, Minister of Justice Denis Maluska. We also offered him our deepest condolences for the loss last week of his and our colleague, Minister of Internal Affairs, Denis Monastyrsky. Minister Maluska gave us a valuable insight into the current situation in Ukraine and his view on the prosecution of core international crimes committed there. And I am, and all my colleagues were as well, very grateful that he took the time to talk to us right now. We were also given presentations by the Swedish Prosecutor General, Peter Lund, and a war crimes prosecutor from the Swedish Prosecution Authority and Eurojust. In our discussions today, examples of good practices from the national prosecution of war crimes in war-torn areas were put forward. It is important that we share these experiences and make best use of our judicial cooperation mechanisms, not least Eurojust's new evidence database, to ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. Today's discussions, I will finally say that, will help us in our efforts to ensure full accountability for the grave crimes committed in Ukraine. There can be no impunity for these crimes. I am very happy with the discussions we had today and yesterday, and I would like to thank everyone who participated. I will now hand over to Commissioner Reinders. Thank you very much for good cooperation. Also during the 2 days together in Stockholm, and please, your remarks on today's meeting.
No, thank you, Gunnar. It's a pleasure, of course, to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. And after the visit of the Commission to Kiruna, it's a pleasure to come back to Stockholm now for the informal Justice Council. Briefly, maybe on judicial cooperation and the fight against organized crime. Today we discuss what is working at EU level and where we can do more. And fight against organized crime needs to be strengthened in Europe with the valuable support of our agency, Eurojust, that supports the investigations and prosecutions of national prosecutors. Fight against drug trafficking is key. Today, all ministers recognize the key role of Eurojust, and there are many requests to go to an action plan about this kind of fight against drug trafficking, and we have listened to the comment of some members of the Council facing a difficult situation at the national level, like in the Netherlands or in Belgium. This will be maybe a discussion that we'll continue to have in the near future. We also had the support from a strong majority of member states to improve the way criminal proceedings are transferred from one member state to another. That is why the Commission will present a new instrument in April, and together with the strong support of the Swedish presidency, we call on the co-legislator to reach an agreement swiftly. So we'll have the opportunity to start in April maybe the discussions about this. And I'm sure that we have a very common approach. Of course, it will be needed to discuss on some rules and some specifications, but we have a real common approach in the Council about that. Finally, I stressed the role of the European Public Prosecutor's Office in fighting organized crime. Take Operation Admiral as an example. In less than 18 months, the European Public Prosecutor's Office uncovered a web of organized crime groups operating in nearly 30 countries responsible for VAT fraud worth €2.2 billion. Without EPPO's transnational vision, I'm certain we would not have uncovered this as we did. As I underlined to ministers today, I hope to see continued and improved cooperation in the future, because we need to enhance such a kind of common action and the cooperation. Of course, we were joined today at the beginning of our lunch to discuss about the situation in Ukraine by the Ukrainian Justice Minister Denis Mayuska. I will have the opportunity to meet him again next week, because the Commission is going to Kiev to have a meeting between the Commission and the Ukrainian government. And I stress during the meeting the key role, again, of our agency, Eurojust. It is producing guidance on screening, identifying and interviewing refugees arriving from Ukraine, for example, in different member states and certainly the neighboring countries of Ukraine. With the International Criminal Court, Eurojust has also produced guidelines for civil society organizations on documenting international crimes and human rights violations on the ground. It's very important to have a very good collaboration with the civil society about that. Thanks to its new mandate, Eurojust is now testing a new core international crimes evidence database to store and preserve evidence of war crimes. This evidence can be used for future trials maybe, because we'll have a lot, to ensure accountability for the crimes committed in the context of the Ukraine war. So it's not only the way to collect, to store, but also to exchange with many different prosecutors at the national level, but also at the international level, the evidence. This is extremely important given the extent of possible war crimes. Nearly 65,000 incidents of alleged international crimes have been reported so far. 14 member states have opened national investigations into international crimes committed in Ukraine, including Sweden, and we have listened from prosecutors of Sweden about the way forward in such a kind of process. These figures illustrate the fact that we are now dealing with the largest number of documented war crimes of all time. This includes the crime of aggression, which is a very specific type of crime. As the judgment of the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg in 1946 stated, a war of aggression is the supreme international crime. While there are different legal constraints to prosecuting the crime of aggression, we must ensure that these crimes will not go unpunished. Those responsible will be held accountable for their actions, and the European Union and the Commission want to play a leading role in such a process to fight also against the crime of aggression. And as a first step to ensure full accountability, I have explained to the ministers that we are working on the possible development of an international prosecution office in the Netherlands, in The Hague, within the framework of a joint investigation team supported by our agency, Eurojust. This JIT was set up at the beginning of the war last year to deal with international crimes committed in Ukraine, in which 6 member states, Ukraine as well as the ICC, participate. And this office will coordinate the evidence collected, particularly for the crime of aggression. So we are sure it's very useful to use the different existing tools like Eurojust, the JIT that we have now, to go forward without any contradiction, of course, with the ICC. And we'll continue to discuss that also with our Ukrainian counterparts next week, I said, in Kiev. Discussions will continue, of course, on the accountability mechanism, including the potential establishment of a special independent international tribunal or an hybrid tribunal based in Ukraine with international representation. Ukraine has made its position very clear in this respect, and we must listen. What is crucial is that whatever is agreed on must have the widest international support, including from the United Nations. To have the legitimacy in our action with such a kind of jurisdiction, we need to be backed by a very large international community. Therefore, we remain in close contact with our international partners. But again, it is so important that we speak with one voice on this. And we are not yet there, but we have made a lot of progress again today in such a way, thanks to the Swedish presidency. And lastly, with regards to accountability for the violation of EU restrictive measures, we are also working to ensure no circumvention goes unpunished. In December, the Commission adopted a proposal for directive, which is now with the European Parliament and the Council. I urge the Council to quickly adopt its position on our proposal that provides criminal sanctions for the persons that circumvent or help circumvent the violation of union restrictive measures. If it's the case, it will be possible to go to justice and no more to organize just the freezing of assets, but the confiscation. And you know that if it's possible to organize a confiscation, it's maybe also possible to transfer the ownership of the assets to Ukraine. that's the first step. Maybe they're also in the way to give a lot of support to Ukraine in such a kind of process. So I was very pleased to see such a common approach and to listen very concrete example provided by Eurojust on one side, but also by the Prosecutor General and the Specialized Prosecutor about war crimes in Sweden. Thank you very much for that.
Okay, so now time for some questions. Please state your name, media organization, and who you direct the question to, please.
Thank you, Léa Marchal for Agence Europe. I have a question for both the Commissioner and the Minister. The first one related to the crime, the war crime. What are the needs? You heard from the Ukrainian Justice Minister. What is he asking for to better prosecute the war crimes? And the second question is rather on the crime of aggression. What will be the concrete next steps to come to this interim prosecutor office that you mentioned? You said that it would be in the frame of the GIT, but does it require a decision at the EU level? And how do you think you can proceed with that? And actually the same kind of question for the special tribunal. I know you said many times this requires the international support, the widest possible, but at EU level, how does it go? Do you need a decision? So how is what is the process basically?
If I start with what the Minister asked for, and then perhaps you can develop next steps and so forth. My impression was clearly that the Ukrainian minister had a very practical, pragmatic approach, which basically means that, one, you have this more serious war crime, the aggression crime, but you also have thousands of war crimes regarding individuals, the civil society, and so forth. I believe that he called for sort of a practical approach, find any way that is efficient and will work in practice to go after the war criminals. And I think that call for action corresponds very well to the general experience in this area. That today I think it was very useful that we started the discussion after his introduction and with two prosecutors working in the national court system, since it's obvious that we will need the judiciary both domestically and internationally to be on their feet and work separately with different levels of crime, you could say, but also interact in many ways. So we know for sure that domestic courts will be critical in order to prosecute all the war crimes we were discussing today. And then in terms of the international level, there is obvious that there are different optional ways to go. And at least from my perspective, and as far as I also understood the Ukrainian minister, he was of the same opinion, find any way that will work. Whether that is ICC or a separate tribunal body or a hybrid one or whatever. But I believe I will leave that to you to develop. Please, Didier.
Thank you again. First of all, I want to say about the war crimes that we are in discussion with our Ukrainian colleagues since the beginning of the war. It's the first time that we are working on the ground from not the day one, but the first days after the beginning of the Russian aggression. I remember a discussion with the Genocide Network in Eurojust in March last year, so it was very soon after the beginning of the war. And what we receive as requests from Ukraine all the time from the Prosecutor General or for the Minister of Justice, like today, is first of all support for the Prosecutor General office. And I said today, to give an example, we have provided 4 million euros for the IT system in the Prosecutor General office, and we try to do the same with the regional Prosecutor's office in Ukraine, like we have asked the Member States, and hopefully it was with a positive response for the Member States, starting with France at the beginning of the process, to send experts, forensic experts, but also protective equipment, security equipment, and so on. So all the time we try to receive precise requests, and I receive all the time a letter from the Prosecutor General about the needs, and we try to provide satisfy those needs. That's very concrete about the way on the ground in Ukraine, because they are on the front line, of course, and they are at the first position to collect evidence. The second element is to work with the member states, and we have 14 member states having started investigations at the national level due to the universal jurisdiction or the involvement of some nationals in the war crimes, like we have seen some murders of journalists during the war, and of course there is immediately an action. And there, what we try to do, again, is to organize a cooperation when it's possible directly with the joint investigation team. We have 6 member states with Ukraine in the JIT, plus the ICC. For the first time ever, the ICC is taking part, and we are close to work more and more with the US also on board in such a process with the joint investigation team. And Eurojust, thanks to the Council and the Parliament, because it was possible to pass an amendment, has an important role, again, about the evidence, so the storage and then the exchange of evidences. And of course, Ukraine is an integral part of it, because Ukraine is in the JIT, but Ukraine is also able to receive, to provide and to receive evidence for the next step in the prosecutions in Ukraine. And of course, the ICC in the same way, and you know that we asked Ukraine to ratify the Rome Statute, to participate fully to the ICC, so I will repeat that next week again in Kiev. Then for the crime of aggression, to see how it's possible to have an operational mechanism very soon in a good functioning. And so that's the way forward. It's not to take a formal decision at the EU level. It's to have a practical functioning with Eurojust, of course, with the members of the JIT, and with Ukraine on board as a member of the JIT too, because it's in fact to operationalize the way to collect evidence in the process about the crime of aggression. So we are now in the last discussions to be sure that we are all aligned on such a kind of process. About the tribunal, I've said myself, we need to continue the discussion. We have received a mandate from the European Council to provide with the High Representative a paper. We have put on the table all the different solutions. You know that Ukraine has requested a special tribunal. There are other possible solutions. We will see. But the next step, to be very concrete, is to be sure that when we will have a discussion at the international level, like in the UN General Assembly, to give an example, we will be there with a unified position from the European Union, with all the member states on the same line. And we are working on it like we are working with our international partners. So it's a second step. So the first one will be the International Prosecution Office to start the process. And then we will continue our discussions on the possible jurisdiction.
Andreas.
Thank you, Andreas Ebring, Swedish Television. A question for both Mr. Strömer and Ms. Reynolds. First of all, regarding Ukraine, what about the time schedule? When do you think there can actually be real work with legal processes here? Second of all, about a tribunal, could the European Union facilitate such a tribunal on its own within the European Union? And thirdly, do you think that accountability should also try to reach the highest leadership of Russia today? Thank you.
Well, just to repeat, the legal process is an ongoing process since the beginning of the war. So we have amended the regulation of Eurojust. I said that today I've urged to work on the proposal of directive for the new criminal offence that consists of the fact it's possible to circumvent the sanctions. So we work all the time with the necessary legal tools. So we'll continue to do that day after day. About the tribunal, I want to repeat what I've said. Of course, we are working, but again, what we try to do now is the first layer, it's the first step with such an international prosecution office, and there we are in discussions with all the actors involved in that, Eurojust, the members of the JIT, Ukraine of course, and we try to see how it's possible to have such a kind of evolution. And of course, it's not to the Commissioner for Justice to say who is responsible. What want to do is to provide to all the prosecutors and one day to all the jurisdictions the possibility to prosecute and to decide about the responsible or the responsible. But it's not, of course, to a commissioner to say who is responsible or not. We try to have an independent process with prosecutors and tribunals or other jurisdictions to do that. But the goal, of course, is to be able to organize a fight against impunity for all the responsible of all the international crimes.
If I might add, I mean, if you look on the first part of your question in more practical terms, you could say that the legal proceedings they have already started. I mean, in any legal proceedings, you of course need to argue the law, but foremost you need to argue the facts, and the facts are already there. So, in too many cases. So it's from, even though sort of the question of where to put these different claims on trial is not solved, at least not sort of the international dimension of it. Still, the national courts, they are there, they have jurisdiction and so forth. But I think the practical approach here is to find ways, to find structures, to find ways to cooperate in order to collect evidence, secure security in a way that it will be useful the very day it will then occur in a court. So in that sense, I would say the timetable is that we have already started off, and then on different also political levels, one can support in order to establish the structures needed to prepare for the prosecutions. In terms of who will be prosecuted, I mean, that is the only sustainable principle point of view, of course. It's up to the judiciary who they at the end will prosecute. But I think one can at least say so much that, of course, the political leadership is not immune to this kind of prosecutions. The ones who are responsible will be prosecuted at the end.
Any other questions? Okay, last question here.
Jan Andersson, Swedish Radio. If you put this case in a bigger context, Mr. Commissioner, how big is this case if you put it after the Second World War? Thank you.
But it's the first time that we have started so early the documentation about international crimes. So that's very, very new, because I have mentioned 65,000 incidents that it was possible to collect in Ukraine and through the refugees coming outside Ukraine. And it's the first time that we are starting so early the process. Of course, it will be also the first time that we will have maybe so many different possibilities to act. I said in Ukraine, and you have seen already some condemnations in Ukraine, and there are other suspects in different prosecution processes, but we have also national member states acting, third countries acting too, the ICC, maybe one day a new solution for the crime of aggression. So I will say it's maybe a turning point in the way to show not only for the authors of the Russian aggression, but maybe for all the possible other actors in the world, that now we are engaged in a process where if you are committed an international crime, you risk for the rest of your life to be in front of a tribunal or a court. And you know that till now there are new decisions, investigations and new decisions about the genocide in Rwanda, or about the war in former Yugoslavia, and very recently, I will say last year, we have seen new condemnation for the Second World War. So it must be very clear that we have all the tools now to say that it's possible to explain that if there are some intentions to commit international crimes, if you are doing that, you take the risk to be in front of a tribunal one day. It's the reason why we have now some procedure, but we'll have procedure maybe in some months, in some years, maybe in some decades, but we will continue to work with such a kind of framework to be able to act. And that is a turning point. So I don't want to say the size, because It's such a very special day when we commemorate the Holocaust. Of course, I don't want to make a comparison between one and another issue. I mean, just to say that now we are well equipped to fight against all types of international crimes, and we continue to complete the framework to do that.
Thank you. So with that, we conclude this press conference. Thank you.
Var det någon